Buried Secrets, the Klan's Hidden Influence. Chapter 1. White Robes, Black Shadows. The town of Millstone, Georgia, was the kind of place where people still waved from porches, and Sunday morning church bells echoed down Main Street. On the surface, it was serene, timeless even. But Clara James, a 29-year-old investigative journalist with a sharp pen and sharper instincts, knew better. She had grown up here, moved away, and now returned. Not for nostalgia, but for answers. Clara had come back after the mysterious death of her childhood friend Marcus. It had been ruled a suicide, but something about it didn't sit right. Marcus had been outspoken, especially about the town's buried history. He had once confided in Clara that he believed the Klan never truly left Millstone. They simply changed their robes for badges, briefcases, and pews. It was a warm September afternoon when Clara stood in front of the old newspaper office, the Millstone Ledger. The building was dusty, the sign sun-bleached. Her mentor, Harold Price, had retired 2 years ago. Since then, the paper mostly ran town events and weather blurbs. Clara intended to change that. Inside, she found old archives stacked haphazardly. She pulled file after file, scanning headlines. Millstone Carnival opens to record crowds. Pastor wins Community Award. Historic church renovation. There was a pattern. Plenty of celebration, very little confrontation. No coverage of past racial tensions. No mention of protests. Nothing on the 2 unsolved arsons in the 1970s. It was as if those events had never happened. That night, Clara drove out to the edge of town, where Marcus's mother still lived. Mrs. Harlow answered the door slowly, her eyes red, her hands trembling. Clara didn't mention the article right away. Instead, they talked about Marcus, his curiosity, his persistence, his fear. Before Clara left, Mrs. Harlow handed her an envelope. "He told me to give you this if anything happened to him." Inside was a folded piece of paper with a single sentence. "Start with the church, look behind the hymnals." The next morning, Clara went to the First Baptist Church of Millstone, the oldest building in town. It stood tall and pristine, its white steeple slicing into the blue sky like a monument to purity. But Marcus had always said, "Clean paint can't cover a dirty foundation." Inside, the sanctuary was empty. Clara walked slowly to the front pews, glancing over her shoulder. Behind the wooden rack of hymnals, she found a small cutout in the wall. She reached inside and pulled out a bundle of old papers. Weathered, brittle. One photograph slipped out. It showed the church congregation from the 1960s, smiling faces, suits, dresses, and at the back, barely visible, a figure in a white hood, standing near the pastor. Clara felt her heart freeze. The date scrawled on the back read June 11, 1964. The church hadn't just hidden history. It had lived it, and now so would she. Chapter 2. The Town That Forgot to Remember. The deeper Clara dug, the more the town resisted. It wasn't overt, not yet, but Millstone had a way of closing its doors and sealing its lips when uncomfortable questions were asked. After the discovery at the church, Clara spent days combing through local records, yearbooks, church bulletins, and civic documents. Something was always missing. Entire years had no documentation. 1965, gone. 1971, barely a whisper. Arrest logs were redacted. Marriage licenses suddenly stopped. Even obituaries were inconsistent. There were too many people who had simply vanished, not just in death, but in memory. She visited the public library's history room, where a musty archive room held yellowing files and old microfilm. The librarian, a soft-spoken woman named Ruth Ann, gave Clara a long look before handing over the keys. "Be careful what you dig up," she said with a forced smile. Hours passed in that room. Clara found pages torn out of old ledgers, tape over names. In one box, labeled Civic Achievements 1960-1980, she found a single sheet inside, a group photo of town council members. Faces familiar from her childhood, all smiling. One man stood in the corner, his face scratched out with black marker. Clara turned the photo over. A handwritten note in red ink read, "Not him, never him." When she tried to scan newspaper reels from those decades, the film jammed. Twice. On the third try, it played. But every frame from 1966 to 1970 was blacked out. Clara frowned. That kind of censorship wasn't accidental. Someone had gone out of their way to erase something. Or she made a list of questions, a timeline of disappearances. She began knocking on doors. Most people were polite. Many were not. "Let the past stay buried," one man snapped, before shutting his screen door. Another woman whispered, "They'll come back if you say their names too loud." But not everyone was silent. One elderly black man named Elijah took her aside behind his garage. "You're Marcus's friend," he said. Clara nodded. "He used to come here. Took notes. Asked the hard questions. Smart boy. Brave." "What happened to those notes?" she asked. He reached into a weathered tin box and pulled out a journal. Clara's breath caught. Marcus's handwriting. Inside were names, dates, maps, symbols he hadn't explained yet, and at the center of it all, circled 3 times, Millstone Historical Society. Clara didn't know what she'd find there, but something told her it wouldn't be history. It would be a secret. Chapter 3. A Cross Beneath the Floorboards. The Millstone Courthouse was undergoing long overdue renovations. Decades of weather and neglect had left the building fragile, its once proud columns now chipped and cracking. Clara managed to secure access to the site by leveraging her press credentials and a few well-placed calls. She arrived early in the morning, her boots crunching over broken tiles and sawdust. "Watch your step," one of the workers called out. "We're pulling up part of the floor today." Clara's eyes lit up. She had a hunch. This courthouse had seen too much to be as clean as its records suggested. As the workers pried up the floorboards near the front of the old courtroom, something strange was uncovered. A burnt, charred piece of wood, buried beneath layers of dust and dirt. One of the men bent down and muttered, "What the hell is this?" Clara rushed over. There was a wooden cross, about 3 feet tall. The edges were blackened, and the center was scorched as though it had been partially set on fire, but never fully burned. Someone had hidden it here, buried it under the very foundation where justice was supposed to be served. Beside it was a small, rusted tin box. Clara knelt, heart racing, and gently opened it. Inside was an envelope, aged and brittle, sealed with a red wax stamp that had faded with time, written across the front in elegant cursive. Reverend Elijah Cartwright, 1963. She carefully slipped the envelope into her satchel and stood, her mind spinning. That night, back in her apartment, she stared at the envelope under a desk lamp. Her fingers hovered over the seal. She broke it. Inside were 3 folded pages, written in precise, trembling handwriting. The first line sent a chill down her spine. "If this is found, know that justice never came from this place." The letter went on to describe meetings held in secret, confessions overheard, names of men who walked freely during the day but wore hoods by night. There were no direct accusations, only implications. Reverend Cartwright knew he was being watched. He wrote that if anything happened to him, it would come not from the light of God, but from the shadow cast by this very courthouse. Clara leaned back in her chair. This wasn't just a story anymore. This was proof. And she was just getting started. Chapter 4. Letters Written in Ashes. The Reverend's letter had changed everything. It wasn't a rumor anymore. It was testimony. Clara made a copy and filed it safely in an encrypted drive before continuing her investigation. Something about the tone of the writing stuck with her. It felt like a man on the edge of revelation, but terrified of the cost. She returned to the courthouse the next morning. The workers were gone, and the air felt heavier. Clara walked through the courtroom again, this time with new eyes. She wondered how many sentences had been handed down in this room, while deeper injustice was buried right beneath it. She sat in the first row of benches and pulled out the letter again, scanning the lines for anything she'd missed. Halfway through, her fingers traced over a phrase, "I have written more hidden away in case the fire finds me first." Clara's pulse quickened. Hidden away. There were more letters. She drove to the old parsonage, listed under Reverend Cartwright's name in the 1960 S-Town directory. The home was abandoned, its white paint peeling, the porch half collapsed. She slipped in through the side door, flashlight in hand. Dust blanketed everything. Old hymnals, cracked furniture, an upright piano long out of tune. In the study, she found the Reverend's desk. Its drawers had been ransacked at some point, papers scattered and burnt in a pile on the floor. But Clara noticed something odd. The fireplace grate had ash, too fresh for a place this forgotten. She crouched down and sifted through the cold ashes. Fragments of paper remained, edges blackened, but text still visible. Came in the night. Deputy's badge. Am I know what I know. Lord, protect Marcus. Clara froze. Marcus. Her Marcus. There was no coincidence. Somehow Reverend Cartwright had written of a child not yet born, or someone from a different generation. A name passed through families, or something deeper, some spiritual knowing passed down. In the corner of the room, a safe was embedded in the wall, hidden behind a portrait of a lake. The paint was faded, the edges curled. Clara pulled it aside. The safe was open. Empty. She wasn't the first. But someone had wanted these letters destroyed, and they almost succeeded. Clara gathered the paper fragments and stored them in a folder. Later, she would have them preserved, digitized, anything to keep them from disappearing. As she stepped outside into the fading afternoon light, she knew this wasn't just about what was hidden in ashes. It was about the fire that came after. Chapter 5. The Judge Who Never Spoke. Judge Richard Ellis had been a fixture of Millstone for over 30 years. Retired now and reclusive, his name still carried weight. People remembered him as stern but fair, a man of principle, they said. But Clara saw something else in the records. His name appeared on almost every major case involving racial violence between 1960 and 1985, and not once did he issue a statement, not a ruling with commentary, not a single press interview, just silence. Clara arranged a visit under the pretense of writing a local profile piece. The Ellis residence sat on the edge of town, a large colonial with overgrown hedges and a rusted mailbox. She was greeted by his nurse, Miriam, who politely informed her the judge didn't do interviews. "Just 5 minutes," Clara said. "I have something he should see." Miriam hesitated, then waved her in. Judge Ellis sat in a leather armchair by the window, a blanket over his lap, his eyes clouded but alert. He looked older than his 82 years. Clara introduced herself. "I'm writing about Millstone's past, sir, and I found something I think you may remember." She handed him the photograph from the church, dated June 11th, 1964. His hand trembled slightly as he took it. For a long time, he said nothing. Then, without looking up, he asked, "What is it you think you found?" "I think you knew. I think you saw things from that bench you couldn't say out loud. I think silence was your shield." He looked at her then, his eyes sharp now. "You think silence is weakness? I think silence is complicity," Clara said. He leaned back slowly. "There are things no verdict could fix. People you can't bring back. The law doesn't always serve justice. Sometimes it just maintains the peace." Clara stood her ground. "And sometimes it maintains a lie." He sighed and pointed toward a bookshelf. "Bottom shelf. Brown folder." Clara found it. Inside were old notes, court transcripts, and newspaper clippings, most of them marked "Do Not File." "May I keep these?" she asked. "Because I couldn't say it then, but someone should say it now." He turned back to the window. Clara left the house holding the file tight to her chest. The judge may never have spoken in court, but now he'd spoken to her. Chapter 6. Sunday Sermons and Secret Meetings. The First Baptist Church of Millstone had always held a special place in the town's identity. Its white steeple and pristine stained glass windows made it the picture of grace and order. But Clara knew that the surface rarely told the whole story. Following the clues left behind by Judge Ellis and the Reverend's letters, she turned her attention back to the church. She arranged a meeting with the current pastor, Reverend Daniel Crowley, a man in his early 50s with a warm smile and a carefully cultivated air of openness. Clara explained she was researching the town's religious history. He offered her access to the old ledgers stored in the church's basement, believing they might be of historical interest. The basement was cool and dim, lined with shelves stacked with dusty hymnals, communion trays, and decades of church bulletins. Clara sifted through records, baptism logs, donation ledgers, and handwritten minutes from congregational meetings. Then she found it. A thick leather-bound ledger labeled Deacons and Session Notes 19501980. The entries began formally, with neat handwriting detailing meetings about sermon schedules and repair work on the church roof. But as Clara flipped toward the 1960S, the tone changed. Several entries were written in a different hand, sharper, more rushed. She read a line aloud under her breath. Special gathering held post-service. Only senior council present, subject not recorded. And again 3 weeks later. Meeting adjourned after extended prayer and private oath. No vote taken. Clara's skin prickled. She ran her fingers down the margins and found a symbol, 3 crosses overlapping, a mark she'd seen once before on the burned letters. She traced the entries and created a timeline. These special meetings always took place during major civil rights milestones. Every Sunday following a demonstration, a local arrest, or a federal court decision. In the back of the ledger, she found a list of initials, dozens of them. At the bottom, it simply said, "Confirmed, bound by silence." Clara stared at the names. Some matched old council records. Some matched Judge Ellis's private files. Others belonged to families still living in Millstone, many of them prominent. This wasn't just church business. These were coordinated efforts to retain control, disguise hatred in tradition, and cloak conspiracy in religion. As Clara turned to leave, Reverend Crowley appeared at the top of the basement stairs. "Find anything interesting?" he asked, voice light. Clara forced a smile. "Plenty of history." "Sometimes history's best left to memory," he said, tone shifting just enough to sting. "Or uncovered," Clara replied. She took the ledger with her, and with it the knowledge that faith had once been used as a mask and Sunday sermons weren't always prayers. Chapter 7. When the Fire Didn't Die. The fire took place on a humid July night in 1972. It was never reported in the local newspaper. There was no police statement, no fire marshal investigation, no public acknowledgement at all. But everyone in Millstone had heard about it. The house belonged to the Parker family, black, well-respected, outspoken. It burned to the ground. Clara tracked down the only surviving member of the family, Lorraine Parker, who now lived quietly on the outskirts of town in a small brick duplex filled with books and faded photographs. Lorraine was cautious at first. "People come around sometimes, wanting to dig up ghosts. I stopped talking to them a long time ago." Clara didn't argue. She simply placed the photo from the church and the copy of Reverend Cartwright's letter on the table. Lorraine's eyes glistened. "My daddy knew Reverend Cartwright," she said. And that night, it wasn't an accident. She spoke in a low voice, steady and sad. She was 16 when it happened. The Parkers had just hosted a town meeting calling for desegregation of Millstone's remaining private clubs. That same week, threats came, notes left in the mailbox, a cross burned in the yard. Then came the fire. Lorraine woke to smoke. She remembered screams, the sound of glass shattering. Her father forced open a window and got her out. Her mother didn't make it. "I saw men outside," she said. white robes. One of them... He had a fireman's badge around his neck. Clara felt a cold wave wash over her. They never came, Lorraine added. The fire trucks didn't come. The town pretended it didn't happen, and the land. The city bought it for public use. There's a storage shed there now. Not a word on what was lost. Clara promised to honor the memory. Before she left, Lorraine handed her a rusted metal tin. Inside were photographs of the house before it burned, of Lorraine's family, of the scorched foundation the next morning. In one photo, barely visible in the background, was a robed figure carrying a red gas can. "There's your truth," Lorraine said. Clara walked away that afternoon with proof of a fire that never officially burned, and of a family that never stopped smoldering in the silence. Chapter 8. Photographs they tried to burn. The attic above the Millstone Historical Society wasn't open to the public. A locked hatch marked with a handwritten sign, "Storage. Staff only," guarded it like a secret, barely pretending to be hidden. Clara had come with permission to access old town event records, but she'd learned long ago that the real stories were never in the displays. It took only a gentle nudge and a crowbar to pry the door open. Dust billowed around her as she climbed the narrow wooden ladder, stepping into a forgotten world of stacked boxes, moth-eaten drapes, and cobwebbed trunks. Her flashlight beam swept across water-stained labels: Civic Parade 1962, Founders Banquet, Ladies Auxiliary, until one box, shoved far in the back, caught her eye. It was unmarked and sealed with heavy twine. She sliced the string and opened the box. Photographs. Hundreds of them. Black and white prints, faded Polaroids, contact sheets. Clara's hands trembled as she flipped through them. They were images of events the town had long celebrated: picnics, baptisms, town hall speeches. But then the smiles started to look rehearsed. In one image, a man receiving a community award stood beside another in partial shadow, only his hand visible, holding a white hood. Another showed a picnic, children in the foreground, and in the distant background, a group of men near a car, with something unmistakably folded under one of their arms: a white robe. Clara's stomach turned. The deeper into the pile she went, the more blatant the symbols became. A burning cross faintly visible in the background of a July 4th celebration. A blurry Klan patch sewn beneath a police badge at a town parade. Town leaders, mayors, school board chairs, church deacons, posing beside men in full Klan regalia, faces proudly exposed. She found a photo of Reverend Crowley's father standing at a pulpit, with a robed figure seated in the front pew. And then a photo she recognized. The same group shot she had seen in the library, council members, the man whose face had been scratched out. In this version his face was clear. It was Pastor Langston, the grandfather of Millstone's current mayor. Clara knew what these were. Not just photos. They were evidence. She packed as many as she could carry into her bag, but just as she started to leave, she noticed the corner of one photograph that had been burned. Only a portion remained. A hand reaching toward a matchstick, the rest of the image lost to ash. Someone had tried to destroy these, but they didn't finish the job. Clara would. Chapter 9. The Whisper Network. After days of doors closing in her face, Clara began noticing something strange. People who weren't speaking publicly, but who were always nearby. In the coffee shop, outside the library, sitting on pews during evening services. They never spoke above a whisper, but they were watching her. It started with a note left on her windshield. "We remember to meet us behind the chapel at midnight." She could have ignored it, but instinct told her otherwise. That night, Clara parked on the edge of the church grounds, her heart racing. The air was thick with humidity and the hum of cicadas. She made her way behind the old chapel, where the trees cast long shadows. 3 people stood waiting, 2 women and a man, all older than Clara, their expressions solemn but resolute. "We were children when it happened," one of them said. "Now we're the last ones who still know." They introduced themselves only by first names, Joyce, Millie, and Curtis. They had grown up in the homes of maids, janitors, and caretakers who served the powerful in Millstone. From their hidden places, kitchens, basements, back rooms, they had heard things. Horrible things. They spoke of secret meetings held late at night in the church. They recalled parents returning home with bruises they refused to explain. They described bonfires that burned without reason and threats passed quietly between white-gloved hands. "We started calling ourselves the Whisper Network," Joyce said. "We wrote down what we saw. We told our children, just in case we disappeared." Clara listened, stunned. Millie handed her a faded composition notebook. Inside were decades of handwritten entries, copied and passed between friends, preserved like scripture. Names, descriptions, dates, each line like a heartbeat that had kept the truth alive in silence. Curtis looked her in the eye. "You can tell this story, Clara, but you need to know. We've carried this weight for generations. If you drop it now, it could all be lost." Clara nodded slowly. "I won't drop it." As they faded into the darkness, Clara clutched the notebook like a lifeline. The Whisper Network hadn't died. It had simply waited for someone to finally speak loud enough. And now they weren't whispering anymore. Chapter 10. A Badge and a Hood. Clara's next stop was the Millstone Police Department. The current police chief, Darren McAllister, had been surprisingly cooperative when she'd reached out, but Clara could sense the tension in his voice. "If you're looking for ancient skeletons," he had said, "just remember, not all of them stayed buried." She met him in a back office filled with filing cabinets and dust. He was younger than she expected, mid-40s, with grey creeping into his beard and cautious eyes. He motioned to a stack of cardboard boxes beside the desk. "These are the pre-digitized personnel files. We're doing a long overdue cleanup. Knock yourself out." Hours passed as Clara poured through files, employment records, disciplinary reports, hiring dates. Many were ordinary. But then she found it. An envelope marked "Fraternal Associations, Private." Inside was a single sheet titled "Fraternal Order of the Millstone Guard," dated 1967. It wasn't an official group. It wasn't legally registered, but the signatures were real. Many were from officers. She compared the names to an anonymous membership roll passed to her by the Whisper Network. Cross-checked, confirmed. Some of the same names were still active in Millstone, or had sons who were, nephews, legacies. At the bottom of the list was a phrase written in Latin, Fiat silentium, fiat ordo. Clara translated it later, "Let there be silence, let there be order." Chills rippled across her skin. She dug deeper and found disciplinary reports quietly sealed, complaints never followed up on, an officer accused of harassment transferred rather than fired, another involved in a suspicious arrest that turned violent, all swept under the rug. Then she opened a file marked L. Carter. It was a personnel record, clean on the surface, until she flipped to the final page. A photograph had been stapled to a memo. Clara's breath caught. It was the same man from a decades-old photo she'd pulled from the church attic, the one in uniform, standing beside a man in a white hood. He hadn't just known, he was part of it. And his grandson? Still on the force? Clara took photos of everything. She backed up the files, encrypted them, made a call to a trusted contact in Atlanta. This was no longer just small-town history, it was an ongoing legacy. When she left the station, she felt the eyes of the receptionist trailing her all the way out the door. A badge, she realized, had always been just another kind of hood. And in Millstone, both still held power. Chapter 11. Bloodlines in blue ink. The revelation about the police files wasn't the end. It was just a crack in the dam. Clara knew that to fully understand how deep Millstone's history ran, she had to follow the names. Not just the ones in uniforms, but the ones in boardrooms, school committees, and town council seats. The people who inherited more than wealth, they inherited silence. She started with the Langston family. Mayor Benjamin Langston was one of the most powerful men in Millstone, his reputation spotless. But Clara knew his grandfather, Pastor Langston, had once stood beside men in robes. Using public ancestry databases and archived census records, Clara began constructing family trees. The Langstons weren't alone. The Carters, the Ellisons, the Mays, all interconnected through marriage, business, or legacy appointments. In the library basement, Clara found an old yearbook from 1959. Handwritten in the margins of several photos were nicknames and annotations, most likely from a former student. Beside the image of Richard "Rick" Carter, "Little Sheriff, Daddy's robe fits." Beside another, "Knows the cross will burn brighter with him in charge." Clara began cross-referencing these names with property records, school board elections, even church directories. The result was chilling, a web of influence spanning decades. Positions of power passed from father to son, campaigns run unopposed, donations funneled to preserve heritage. But it wasn't until she found the sealed probate records in the courthouse archives that the final thread unraveled. In one document, Last Will and Testament of Reverend Horace Langston, it stated plainly, "To my grandson, Benjamin, I leave not only my name and reputation, but the truths I was sworn to protect. Keep the oath, guard the order." Attached was a sealed envelope marked, "To be opened only if the fire returns." Clara stared at the words. The fire. Everything came back to that fire. Burning crosses, torched houses, charred secrets. She copied the entire file, knowing full well that publishing it would put her in the center of a generational storm. Bloodlines didn't lie. And in Millstone, they didn't bleed red. They bled blue ink. Chapter 12. the archive that wasn't meant to survive. The Millstone Library had always seemed harmless, quiet, friendly, underfunded. But Clara had learned to trust her instincts, and hers were telling her there was more behind the neat rows of books and dusty filing cabinets than met the eye. Ruth Ann, the head librarian, was in her late 70s now, with kind eyes and a sharp memory. Clara had spoken to her once before, but this time she came with names: Langston, Carter, Cartwright, and a quiet determination. Ruth Ann didn't say much. She simply stared at Clara for a long moment, then motioned for her to follow. They walked past the public stacks, past the genealogy records and town maps, to a locked supply closet near the staff room. Ruth Ann unlocked it with a small brass key and stepped inside. She reached up to the top shelf and pulled down a weathered, unlabeled cardboard box. "I was told to throw this away in 1993, she said. "Didn't feel right, so I hid it." Clara opened the box slowly. Inside were file folders marked "Do Not Catalog." Dozens of them. Town meeting transcripts, sealed court testimonies, anonymous complaint letters, and black and white photos that had never seen the light of day. She pulled out a transcript titled "Closed Session, July 10, 1969. The names of council members were redacted, but the topic of discussion wasn't. Concerning response to demonstrations and out-of-town organizers. Agreement reached to maintain order by informal deterrence. Discussed coordination with sympathetic enforcement personnel. Another folder contained internal memos between the mayor's office and church elders, referencing preserving the balance of tradition. One memo read, "Public-facing tolerance must be balanced with private reinforcement of boundaries." Buried in the bottom of the box, Clara found a small cloth-covered book titled Heritage Meetings 19621975. It was handwritten, and inside were minutes from secret gatherings involving town officials, law enforcement, and religious leaders. One entry read simply, "Pros delivered, order reaffirmed, brothers remain committed, watch the girl." The date was 2 weeks after Reverend Cartwright's last known sermon. Clara's throat tightened. She carefully returned the materials to the box. "Mamie," she asked. Ruth Ann looked at her. "Because you asked, and because you didn't stop asking." As Clara walked out of the library that day, box in her arms, she knew she had stumbled on something few were ever meant to see. And now it was her burden to make sure no one ever forgot. Chapter 13. Justice Buried in a Cotton Field. It was Curtis, one of the Whisper Network, who first mentioned the name. Luther Mayfield, a laborer barely 20 when he vanished in 1963, no body, no police file, just a note in the back of a Sunday school ledger. Didn't show up for harvest, ain't seen since. Clara had nearly overlooked it, but something in Curtis's voice stuck with her. He said he remembered his father whispering the name late one night, voice trembling. Luther didn't just disappear, Curtis had said. He was taken. Curtis agreed to take Clara to someone who might know more, a reclusive farmer named Dale Kinney. His family had worked the same stretch of land outside Millstone for generations. Dale was in his 60s, weathered, quiet. He met Clara at sunrise near the edge of his fields, the cotton still heavy with dew. "I don't talk about this," he said without preamble. but I'll show you." They walked half a mile into the property, where the land dipped into a gentle hollow, surrounded by trees that seemed to lean inward. "I was 12 when it happened," Dale said. "Daddy told me not to go near this patch, said it was cursed, said they buried the devil here." He stopped at a bare patch in the field. No crops grew there, even decades later. The earth was dry, grey, and cracked. Next season, cotton wouldn't take, still won't. Clara knelt, brushing her hand across the soil. It felt different, harder. Dale pulled a rusted spade from his truck and dug. Just a few inches down, the dirt shifted. Wood, then fabric. Clara helped uncover what remained of a wooden box, warped, half decayed. Inside, wrapped in plastic and linen, were bones, and beneath them, sealed in a weathered mason jar, a photograph. It showed a young black man standing beside a pickup truck, smiling. On the back, written in faded ink, "Luther Mayfield, 1963. Clara couldn't speak. Her throat closed around the weight of history. "I ain't ever told no one," Dale said quietly. "Not until now. But maybe you can do something with it." Back in her apartment, Clara wrote Luther's name on the top of a fresh page in her notebook. Not just a victim, not just a statistic. A man, buried not by time, but by silence. Until now. Chapter 14. The Oath That Echoes. Clara had heard a rumor for weeks, passed quietly, always ending in, "He won't talk." The man was Arthur Maddox. Once a respected businessman, now a recluse living in a rundown house at the edge of town. He'd been in the background of several photos Clara had uncovered, always at the edges of the frame, always looking away. She didn't knock on his door. She waited. She parked her car across the road every afternoon for 3 days. On the 4th, the porch light flicked twice. Then the door opened. Clara entered the house and was met with a stale scent of dust and old paper. Arthur sat in a chair facing the fireplace, a cane resting across his lap. "You found enough to know what we were," he said. "I need to know why," Clara replied. He was silent for a long time. Then he pulled from a drawer an old notebook wrapped in cloth. He placed it on the table and tapped it once. "The oath," he said. "It wasn't just words. It was a pact. It bound us to each other and to silence." He opened the notebook. Clara leaned in, scrawled across the first page. "Order of Preservation, 1956, Initiates." Then the words of the oath. "With fire and veil, with faith and soil, I swear to hold the line. I speak no truth that weakens the shield, nor yield to mercy that threatens the chain." Every man who joined repeated that in blood, Arthur said. Some meant it, others just feared what came if they didn't. He showed her a list of names. Some were still in office. Some had passed their positions to family. Arthur's name was there too, crossed out. "I left after the fire," he said. "After we buried Luther. I didn't speak up. I watched the boy's mother scream at nothing while the town looked the other way." Clara asked, "Why now?" "Because you're not scared," he said, "and because someone needs to burn the oath before it binds another generation." He handed her the notebook. "That's the last piece. Publish it. Bury us." Clara walked out into the cold air, notebook in hand. and for the first time, the wind didn't feel so heavy. The oath had echoed for too long. It was time to silence it. Chapter 15. Digging Up the Silence. The council chamber was packed. Clara stood at the front, facing a semicircle of town leaders, men and women whose names matched the files she'd uncovered, the photographs she'd preserved, the oaths she'd transcribed. Behind her sat townspeople, some curious, others nervous. Many looked away when she turned. She placed the boxes on the table: photographs, documents, transcripts, sworn letters. Then she took a breath. "My name is Clara James," she began, voice steady, "and I'm here today not just as a journalist, but as someone born here, someone who wants the truth told." She began with Marcus, with the envelope he left. She showed the photograph from the church, June 11th, 1964. She read from Reverend Cartwright's final letters and from Arthur Maddox's notebook. She listed the names, carefully, clearly, of those involved in the order of preservation. Gasps, silence. A few council members leaned forward. Others turned red. Clara pressed on. She told them about the Parker fire, about Luther Mayfield's grave, about the hidden archives and buried records, and finally, she held up the oath, the handwritten code passed down for decades to keep the town's dark history shrouded. She looked out at the audience. "This isn't just a story, it's our truth, and if we don't face it, it will bury us again." One council member, a woman named Denise Hargrove, stood. "What are you asking for?" Clara didn't hesitate. Transparency, public release of sealed files, official acknowledgement of the events that happened, a memorial for victims like Luther Mayfield, and a community forum to let people speak without fear. There was a long pause. Then someone clapped. Then another. And another. The room didn't erupt, but it shifted. The silence cracked. Later that night, Clara sat on the porch of her apartment, staring out into the quiet street. The air felt lighter. Somewhere, wind chimes moved gently, the first sound Millstone had made in decades that hadn't come from fear. She opened her notebook and wrote 2 words at the top of the page: Part 1, because this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of everything finally being heard,